and gentlemen, welcome to our CIL eConference on International Trade and Investment Law in the Post-COVID-19 world. Allow me to introduce to you our distinguished moderator, who has served as a chief negotiator for Singapore in several trade agreements, a World Trade Organization dispute settlement body panelist, and who is currently a principal trade specialist in the Ministry of Trade and Industry of Singapore, Ms. Elizabeth Chelliah.
It's a very timely topic with COVID, and most of us, as you can see, beaming out to you from our respective homes, because most of us are all in lockdown situations. And so it's an interesting time. It raises a lot of interesting legal questions, both domestically in terms of force majeure contracts that are being affected, and then in the international trade scene, because this is the first time it's a global phenomena. I mean, we had SARS, we had H1N1, but they were more of a regional impact. But this time, COVID seems to be very global. Supply chains have been disrupted. We have a lot of countries who then are looking out for themselves and putting in export restrictions, import elevation and all that. And so it makes the whole trading world a bit uncertain. It calls in for a lot of legal issues at play. And so it's good that we have this discussion now. So without further delay, let me introduce you to the opening speaker, Mr. Lionel Yee, who's the Deputy Attorney General of Singapore of the Attorney General's Chambers. Prior to his current appointment, Lionel Yee held appointments as the Solicitor General, a Judicial Commissioner of the Singapore Supreme Court, and the Director General of the International Affairs Division in the Attorney General's Chambers, Singapore. He provides advice on public international law to all agencies of the Singapore government. So he's well placed to set the scene. So Lionel, without further, I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Liz. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to you wherever you may be. Let me say it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to this third in a series of webinars organized by the Center of International Law to discuss various international law issues which have arisen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think as with the previous two sessions, we've had a huge response to this session, not just from our region and the time zones around it, but also well beyond. And I want to acknowledge in particular those of you who are in the Americas, where it is now, in fact, the early hours of the morning. Thank you for showing such great commitment to the pursuit of international law. Because the pandemic has affected so many facets of human activity, we've had to hold a series of 5 webinars looking at its impact on different aspects of international law. The first session considered the global, regional, and national public health governance issues. And then the second session, which was held last week, discussed the tensions between the different sets of rights, including human rights. In today's and tomorrow's sessions, we turn our attention to international economic law, with today's session focusing on international trade law and tomorrow's on international investment law. When one reflects on the impact of COVID-19 on international trade and investment law, what is striking is how both have been the products of the globalization which we have witnessed over the past few decades. It is globalization and the resulting appreciation of the desirability of trade liberalization and the facilitation of cross-border investments, which has shaped much of the landscape of international trade and investment law and its institutions that we know today. But globalization is also the reason why COVID-19 has spread so far and affected so many so quickly. The response of governments in different parts of the world to this common crisis in imposing unprecedented peacetime restrictions affecting the movement of persons, and economic activity has been fairly similar. But individual governments have to varying degrees also taken all sorts of self-preservation measures, such as interventions to support the local economy and to protect industries from collapse, and the imposition of export restrictions on face masks, personal protective equipment, and ventilators, as well as on essentials like wheat and rice. And all these quite extraordinary measures interface with many disciplines in the existing legal regimes governing the movement of goods, the supply of cross-border services, subsidies, the protection of investments, etc. And moving forward, as governments look to diversifying their sources of supply and to ramping up local production, and scientists rush to develop vaccines, other international trade and investment law issues, such as the protection of intellectual property rights, will also arise. I think so far the legality of most governmental measures has not been the focus of much attention or scrutiny. But we can expect that to change as the weeks and the months pass and infection curves flatten and pressures to lift restrictions grow. And when that increased scrutiny takes place, we should bear in mind that international trade and investment law issues are subject to compulsory dispute settlement procedures to a degree that is quite unmatched by almost all the other international law norms, be they human rights or state responsibility, that the pandemic has brought into play. And looking into the more distant future, what influence will the experience of the pandemic have on the development of international economic law and institutions? Will the greater appreciation of our dependence on each other lead to increased collaboration and greater liberalization across economies? Or will we see the anti-globalization and protectionist movements which have arisen since the global financial crisis strengthen and become the dominant dynamic? Or might it be something in between, with regional organizations or coalitions of like-minded states committing to collective action in securing cross-border trade flows, as some have already done? Well, for me as a deliverer of the opening remarks, I have the privilege of setting the stage and identifying the issues. But I do hope that our panelists, who are the experts in the relevant fields, will shed some light on some, maybe most of these issues in the course of this session and tomorrow's session. So thank you for your attention, and I will hand the floor back to our moderator, Liz.
Thank you very much, Lionel. I think you set the scene very well, painted a very good overview as to what the current situation is, and raised our focus on what next. You're right, as things flatten and some countries go back to as normal as possible, then there'll be a heightened concern as to why am I missing something? Why is business not moving as smoothly as it should? And that could raise a lot of international trade issues, disputes. So I think it's very nice that our next speaker, first panelist, is Ms. Gabrielle Marceau, PhD, Senior Counselor currently in the Research Division of the WTO Secretariat. But Gabrielle has a lot of dispute experience because since 1994, she has, when she first joined the GATT Secretariat, her main function was to advise panelists in WTO disputes. I'm one of the lucky ones, so I've been very well advised by her in one of my panel sessions. And for several years, her main function has been on this issue. From September 2005 to January 2010, she was legal advisor in the cabinet of the former WTO Director General Pascal Lamy. And from September 2016 to 2017, she was acting director, officer in charge for Legal Affairs Division. If that is not enough to keep on her plate, she's also the associate professor at the law faculty of the University of Geneva and has been visiting professor in the Graduate Institute of Geneva, the Sorbonne in Paris, Monash, and she has also been coming to train us in Singapore on a few occasions. We have worked very closely with Gabrielle. She was the advisor for Singapore's one and only WTO dispute. And so our relationship goes very close with her. And so I give the floor to Gabrielle to give her views on how do you think the trade law will be affected by the COVID situation. Gabrielle, over to you.
Thank you, Liz. I'm delighted and honored to be with you all today and to be invited in Singapore, although virtually, because we will soon see that Singapore and with others were among the first countries to do the right thing. I'll develop this a little bit about trade law, but also trying to explain what is done in the WTO context to deal with COVID. I will not speak in my first 5 minutes or so about the appellate body crisis, but I'll be happy to get back to that because, as it was just said, dispute is not the focus at the moment. It's other values of the system, but it may come. And I was wondering where to start about what's happening in the WTO, because I can look at it from an academic or from a civil servant. And as a civil servant, I should talk about the WTO members' actions first before talking about the Secretariat. So I'll do that. I'll say a few words about what's happening in the WTO, which is, as mentioned, not only a place where disputes take place, but first and foremost, a forum of negotiations, and I would say even more discussions. The WTO is a forum where transparency as a value is expressed, and it becomes crucial with COVID, and collaboration. So more colleagues will give more details, but the WTO has become the place at the moment where, of course, governments try to get together because COVID will be dealt with and can be dealt with only with some minimum and more coordination as possible. So you have had a series of declarations taken in region and brought back to the WTO, or taken in the WTO as such, like the one last week by a whole group of governments saying and repeating the importance of connectivity of value supply chains, the importance of working together for research, to not imposing restrictions, all these things that Singapore and New Zealand in their joint ministerial statement of March started. But WTO, being the only multilateral forum for trade, is the place where this is now mentioned and discussed, although virtually. You are also aware that in the WTO, there's a monitoring system where governments are invited to report their actions. And at the last crisis in 2008, this monitoring system gained some further importance, and again this time. So the staff, if you want, the experts from the divisions have started looking at measures put in place by countries and contacted those countries to make sure they agree and put them public on the website. There's a new website page on COVID to which I'll get back, but putting them public not to sort of give any lesson, but to help other countries see what the others do and facilitate this coordination. So at the moment, for instance, last week, the last time we counted, there were 123 facilitating measures reported and 108 that are said to be more restrictive. And we have also a separate sort of reporting for service measures, 89 of them. And again, it's more to learn from each other and improve coordination than scolding members. The goal is more transparency for further collaboration. In that same context, On this Friday, on 15, there's a General Council meeting that will take place, virtual, the first one, where members will talk about what can be done on COVID and things related to COVID, such as virtual meetings. So that's a plus. Some have even suggested that a task force is set up amongst members. We shall see. I'll talk in a few minutes about the task force within the Secretariat. Of course, DG Azevedo has been amazing because he has been in contact with several relevant IGOs and made declarations to encourage industries and players, governmental and non-governmental, to really work together. So I can count the FAO, the IMF, the WHO, the WCO, the ICC, and support to the G7, the G20, and the sort of pledge movement. So I think the WTO has rarely been so active, and not in the field where I traditionally work, dispute as mentioned, but rather the field of actions for governance, as you mentioned. I want to quickly go now to the next, which is the actions within the Secretariat, where a task force was formed under the Director of Research, Koopman, and where papers of all types have been done on transparency, export restrictions, e-commerce that becomes more important than ever, regional trade agreement, agriculture. So these are all actions initiated by the DG to support and assist members. Now, my last point is about the legality of all those actions, and I'll come back in my next sort of set of comments. But yes, there are many actions that are taking place. Many are better and consistent as those suggested by Singapore, reducing tariff, facilitating imports, but others are more questionable, of course. Export restrictions can be legal if they're temporary in terms of crisis, and this is what we face. What is risky is that they last. So the COVID crisis can be an occasion to improve situation, and we've seen it in the area of standards, TBT, SPS, where a lot of governments have lowered their requirements and accepted, instead of paper copies, electronic copies, for instance, accelerating transition and transit. What we will see is whether these good practices continue and whether other practices that are inherently temporary also continue. There are questions, and I'll get back to that when later on, about subsidies. There are lots of things that are tolerated because they're temporary. And remember, it takes time to initiate and complete a dispute. So if you have a program for 6 months, there's no reason to initiate a dispute. But I would end in saying that the impact on trade is that this crisis proves that trade is more important than ever, because trade inherently is about collaboration. And there are lots of ways to help your people and others in a WTO consistent way. And of course, there are restrictions of all sorts that can be put in place, hopefully only on a temporary basis. I will not expand more than that, but I'm happy to go back to any aspects later on. Thank you, Liz.
Gabrielle, I think you have touched on some very key points about how you have a diverse response, and I'm glad to note that the number of facilitating measures is higher than the number of restrictive measures. It would be good, as you have pointed out, if the facilitative measures continue and rules are put in place to facilitate that even more, especially in accepting the digital documentation. I think that's the way to go as we move forward. Temporary, yes, there's a lot of stimulus packages all over the place because you want to make sure that your economy can survive. I guess when the flattening starts to take place and some reopening, then there'll be some query as to whether these are good or bad stimulus. And so that's something we can address as the session goes on. And I'm glad to see the action that the DG has taken. I mean, we've been seeing numerous declarations that have come out between the WTO, WCO, WHO, and it just never ends, even on FAO. And so these are all the positive aspects. Would any of the other panelists like to say anything about the points raised by Gabriella at this stage? Nope, I don't see anyone. So then I shall move on to Rebecca, Tan Sri Dato Rebecca, currently the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat and also a close friend from before. She serves as advisory body implementing arm and custodian of international memory of the 21 member economies that make up the APEC Forum. Tan Sri Maria was a top-level Malaysian civil servant and trade negotiator. That's how our paths crossed in the past. As Secretary General of the Malaysian Ministry of International Trade and Investment from December 2010 to July 2016, she oversaw the formulation of Malaysia's international trade policies and positions. She often took the lead in their implementation as chief negotiator for bilateral and regional free trade agreements such as TPP and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. Rebecca played an integral role in Malaysia's participation in multilateral forums such as APEC, where she often represented her economy during the APEC ministers responsible for trade meetings and the small and medium enterprise ministerial meetings. Rebecca, I'm pleased to announce as a fellow woman, is the first woman executive director of the APEC Secretariat, with all the focus now on women in international trade. That's a very positive trend. In ASEAN, Rebecca chaired the body that drafted the ASEAN Economic Community 2015 Blueprint, as well as the AEC 2025 Blueprint. She's an accomplished academic and writer. Her scholarship has been recognized through awards from the American Academy of Human Resource Development and from the University of Georgia. In 2017, she authored a book about her personal slice of Malaysian heritage and cuisine called The Smell of Home. Before 2010, the position of Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat rotated yearly amongst the officials. In fact, I'm pleased to just announce that when Singapore was hosting APEC in 2019, we changed that. So that's why now you have permanent executive directors, and we have Rebecca here, who's going to tell us, I guess, about ideas that APEC is focusing on as we deal with this COVID issue and trade law. So Rebecca, I hand the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I must caveat this whole thing by saying that I'm not a lawyer. But I'm going to walk through some of the details and some of the things that we've done in APEC. But before that, as we all huddle in our homes, working from home, this is an appropriate time for reflection, learning from mistakes, learning from this whole process. And the question is, whether globalization, you get a lot of these questions about, is this the right way to go? Is this caused by globalization? What will the world post-COVID-19 look like? Are we headed towards this term that's now being used, which upsets me a little bit, de-globalization? Are we going to have more integration or less? Will there be more onshoring? Or and these are all the questions that keep, I suppose, policymakers awake at night. Will there be less emphasis on outshoring? And will we be looking to move to other regions, changing and diversifying our chains? Will Asia be the benefit? Will Africa be the benefit? Will Pacific economies of South America benefit from this movement in supply chains, these changes in the supply chains? For sure, the China lockdown disrupted supply chains, and not just globally, but also domestically in China. So we will need some level of adjustment of of supply chains. And this is also tied to distance and logistics as we're thinking about moving and shifting global chains. global supply chains. We see this clearly in the area of medical supplies. So let me take a bit of time to put this in perspective. The global trade in medical goods to support the fight against COVID-19 is significant and amounts to almost $1 trillion. The APEC economies themselves account for almost 41%, or over $400 billion in global import value for medical goods. And we also account for almost 29% of global export value. And more than 90% of the trade in medical goods involves only 10 APEC economies. So you see the balance here, the imbalance here. And most APEC economies apply low MFN, most favored nation tariffs to medicines and medical equipment, but they impose higher tariff rates on medical supplies, personal protective products that are essential for tackling this pandemic. Trade policy also is an important tool to facilitate access to medical goods to cope with the challenges raised by this pandemic. And APEC is a forum that's looking at this and discussing this. This is where we spend time. The different groups within APEC are doing this, whether it's a health working group, whether it's the Life Sciences Innovation Forum, whether it's the tourism working group. These are folks who are, of course, the Trade and Investment Committee looks at this as well. We discuss collective initiatives to permanently reduce and eliminate tariffs on medical goods and the equipment and services linked to the pandemic. And what we see is that there is a lot more that can be done among the economies to deal with this, to keep markets open. We keep talking about this. So, you know, this pandemic has really brought home to roost the issues of keeping markets open. You know, I think that with this, we will not see less globalization. What we will see more diversification. We will see increased regionalization, probably more agile, so that you can make changes faster. So there's that question of agility and making quick adjustments to your manufacturing processes and sourcing of what you call these inputs for your process. This pandemic has also smoked out weaknesses in our trading systems, the connectivity issues, the logistics issues. You know, we've in APEC and ASEAN, we've looked at the single window, right? When Gabrielle talked about electronic documentation, acceptance of electronic documentation. We've been working in ASEAN and APEC for the single window exercise. Now, this pandemic brings it to the fore. We need to step that up. We need to do more in that area. So if you're looking at us as policymakers, as trade people, what is trade law? Trade law is really coming through from policy, trade policy. And what is trade policy? And does it matter? For me, it goes back, and this is where the relevance is for folks in the legal profession. It's ultimately about rules that we all agree and comply with. So a rules-based trading system, the raison d'etre of WTO. It's about transparency, predictability. If you're going to do business, these things matter. So, and it's also about trust in a system. Gabriella mentioned SPS, you know, phytosanitary certification and sharing of information on SPS, technical requirements. What is that? But it has a system that's based on trust and good regulatory practice. I mean, these are things that we've been doing also in APEC. For medical services, medical goods itself, the Life Sciences Innovation Forum in 2018 or maybe 2015, I forget the time, but they came up with this toolkit, a supply chain toolkit, which provides all the elements to enhance the movement of medical goods. This was in response to SARS at that time, but now it's even more relevant. So it's now the group is revisiting what they've done and to look at all the elements in the supply chain for medical goods. And we need to strengthen this. So there's work that's being done on that score. Let me also just say, just to reiterate, I mean, everyone has made some statements about how important it is to keep the markets open, and the ministers the APEC ministers related to trade too have come up with a statement where they emphasize the need to ensure that we work collaboratively as a forum to ensure that we keep supply chains open, that we keep markets open, so that we help each other. At the end of the day, it's a policy of supporting each other. It is not going down the route of more protectionism and a beggar thy neighbor sort of situation, because that would just be more detrimental to the global trading environment. So let me stop here, Liz, and we can come back to some of the other issues and some of the things that we're doing, whether in APEC or in ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I see that APEC has been doing a lot of good work building up based on earlier crisis and not just waiting for COVID to start doing work. So that's been very good. As you have pointed out, it's good for us to see how we can strengthen it further, because the only downside, if I might say, about APEC is that it's non-binding. So how do we focus and change these policy directives into transparent and predictable trade laws that will help our business navigate these areas? And not just business, but I think COVID has also pointed out a consumer need, because we were all rushing out to get masks, hand sanitizers, and all sorts of things. So it's not just business, it's all of us were affected when supply chains got disrupted. And unfortunately, as with everything, there were some who tried to profit from the whole situation. So if you just look at that individual human nature, it's not surprising then that also some governments try to profit from the situation. So how to find the balance and have something predictable is what we are trying to see as now some of the economies are emerging out of a deeper crisis. Would any of the panelists like to comment? Gabrielle, you have unmuted yourself. Would you like to have a few words?
Yeah, a few words. Thank you. I like regional trade agreements, and I like the comment about the crisis may lead towards increased regionalization, and it's correct, let alone because of the trust aspect and the need for diversification. However, we have to remain careful, and it's certainly not the Asians who are not careful on that front. We have to remain careful because some regions do not have the capacity to produce regionally. And some products, such as medical device, some of them really are part of a world production supply chain. So then RTAs have to remain sort of a healthy transit route. And there's an SCAP project at the moment, very good. And Liz, you circulated a document from one of your colleagues. It's good if free trade agreements and regional trade agreements push products. And as it is legally in trade law, regional trade agreements are good in international trade, but as anything else, they can be bad, and it's important to be vigilant. But I fully agree with the idea that we will need to, it will lead to a reinforcement, as it is for the car production, for instance, in NAFTA and in North America. But you may have seen yesterday the press comment from Senator Grassley in the US, a bit angry at Mexico closing down industries because it affects the supply chain. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if I may, Liz, one of the things, like I said, we've smoked out the weaknesses in our system. It's like when you concentrate, there's this concentration of production, manufacturing in a certain economy or a certain sector, that then leads to the kinds of issues that we have today. When too much is concentrated in one segment, and if anything happens, we saw that during the tsunami, you remember, and the supply chain for the auto sector, when everybody had to rethink their supply chains because of concentration. So that again is a lesson that is being repeated, and like I said, this is a time for us to reflect on what has been happening and how we can make facilitate trade and ensure that it benefits everybody. Trade goes down, employment goes down, people suffer. It's as simple as that. So keeping this going is our responsibility.
Thank you very much. I agree. I like the point that you raised about how there's so much concentration of the medical goods in just 10 economies. And then this is why they could then call ransom, and everybody was then, paying astronomical prices because, they had to supply for their own needs. And then you had dear Mr. Trump trying to use old legislation to get his US companies just to supply America and not the rest of the world. So, this is an interesting perspective that was taking place as well. But I agree, maybe one of the issues as we go about is this, as we move, because I think Rebecca made a very good point, because what is trade law? It's a reflection of trade policy. So what is the policy direction that we actually want to go towards from the lessons that we have learned out of this COVID situation? What is it that we want to facilitate? A key lesson is how we need to do regional diversification, and for that, maybe capacity building needs to be coming through a different prism when you look about ratcheting up, so that you don't have this holding ransom the whole world anymore. Then we should also look forward to see what next, the next step, because now we are battling the virus, so everyone is rushing up for the mask, the sanitizer. But as it flattens out and people start to travel, what do we need to have that comfort that you can move about? And also these are the policies that we need to think about. I like the point you made also about how the PPEs and the masks have a very high tariff because they're associated with textiles. And textiles, in most countries like agricultural goods, face very high tariffs. So is this the time to relook at some of these issues? I noted that for some quarters, people are asking to relook at the Eurograde pharmaceutical agreement. I think Rebecca at APEC, y'all had also touched upon that, but looking at a more comprehensive list beyond just the pharma products, but for all this ancillary, taking guidance from the WCO list of what are the essential goods for this period. So a lot of ideas coming out already, and we've only had 3 speakers. So now I turn to Derek, who will give us a bit of the Singapore perspective. Already Gabrielle started the whole thing by praising Singapore for taking the lead on facilitating movement of goods through our first declaration with New Zealand. Derek is recently appointed as the Deputy Director General, Economic and Social in the International Affairs Division of the Attorney General's Chambers, where he has spent the last 11 years advising the Singapore government on public international law issues. Prior to joining the AGC in February 2009, he was in private practice specializing in international trade law. He was also a trade policy official with the Singapore government from May 1996 to December 1999. In fact, he was my colleague in the Trade Development Board during that period. So again, another panelist who we share a long relationship. So Derek, you have the floor to tell us your perspective from the Singapore lens.
Thank you very much, Liz, for the introduction, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone from Singapore. I've been asked to speak a few words about Singapore's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And if some of this sounds familiar, it's because I agree with Gabrielle and Rebecca. In a nutshell, Singapore has been actively promoting collective action, cooperation among states to address the disruption to supply chains caused by COVID-19. To date, we have issued several statements and declarations with other countries under which we committed to maintain open and connected supply chains, remove tariffs, refrain from imposing export restrictions, consult on removing non-tariff measures, as well as expedite and facilitate the movement of goods across borders. Some examples, just to name a few, are the joint ministerial statement with 10 other countries. Now, originally this was with New Zealand, but since then other countries have signed up, and we would encourage others to do so. Building on this joint ministerial statement, Singapore and New Zealand then fleshed out the details of the cooperation declaration. And since then, we are also working with Australia, Canada, and Korea to see how we can facilitate the flow of goods and services, as well as the movement of people across borders, of course, in a safe way. Regionally, we are also actively contributing to the efforts of ASEAN and APEC, which are also similarly addressing these issues. I just want to mention that these are essentially political commitments. They are not legally binding as such, but I think the intention nonetheless is still to implement them in good faith. Thus, 1 week after we signed the declaration in New Zealand, we received our very first shipment of supplies from them. Besides New Zealand, I must also acknowledge that similar cooperation is underway between Singapore and its neighbors and other countries as well. Now the question is, why has Singapore been so active in promoting supply chain connectivity? The answer should come as no surprise to anyone. Singapore is a very open economy, highly dependent on trade. We import most of our supplies, including medical supplies and foodstuff. And although we have stockpiles that can see us through several months of this disruption, they will eventually have to be replenished. Then the question is, but why cooperation? And why not enforcement of legal rights? Well, simply because we think that this is the best way to achieve the most in the shortest period of time. There are definitely limitations to the litigious approach. Firstly, as Gabrielle has mentioned, that international trade rules do allow countries to impose export restrictions. And there are, of course, questions now as to whether certain of the restrictions or the state aid are given by certain member states, whether they have been done in a manner that is in accordance with the conditions set for them. And this brings me to my next point, which is that formal dispute settlement takes time. And there is no guarantee of success. Moreover, as Gabrielle has mentioned, many of these measures are temporary in nature, such that they are likely to be lifted even before the launch of dispute settlement proceedings. My third point is that the WTO is not fully functioning at this time. Like other international organizations, meetings have been suspended for social distancing purposes. And I am happy to note that in 2 days' time, there will be the first virtual meeting. It's a start. But as far as I know, dispute panel hearings are still not being held. So even if you were able to bring a dispute, and even if you have a panel hearing, and even if you get a panel outcome, the decision may well be appealed into the void event at the end of the day because there is no appellate body to hear it. All of this points to the need to have a different pathway at this time to address the immediate concerns and challenges posed by COVID-19. And in our view, it is cooperation or collective action. So far, happy to say, it has been working out well. Let me conclude by saying that countries are starting to ease their lockdowns. From India to Italy, from Australia to America, economies are at different stages of reopening as curves flatten within the jurisdictions. There are, however, worries about a second or a third wave of infection. Therefore, it is imperative that countries do not relax on their efforts to ensure that global supply chains are well oiled so that they can better weather the next wave or the next pandemic. Someone has said that we are all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. Perhaps the solution will come when we realize that in order to safely navigate out of the storm, everyone must work together. I hope that our discussion this afternoon will contribute to this broader conversation on the topic. I think I'll just end here this, and then perhaps I invite comments from the rest of the panelists.
Thank you very much, Derek. I think, yes, the key point is that Singapore, we are known for being very practical. We need to do things to get the goods moving. It's no use being litigious and get tied up all in knots, and then the goods are all stuck on the port and nothing is moving. So it's a very good collective international response that we try to spearhead. Just be practical. One of the issues that we have noted actually arising from all the supply chain facilitation that is taking place is not really always the rules which have been slowing down the supply chain, but the knock-on impact of the lockdown, because you don't have enough people to drive the trucks, you don't have people to fly in the planes, so the planes have all stopped, and therefore cargo is not moving. And so you need to have a very focused effort to see how to keep this going. And then now in China, you have them taking measures to say that how cargo needs to be disinfected before it can be moved onto their shore. And so there are all these other issues also that we need to take into account as we keep the supply chains going. One of the points which has been raised is that we have been very focused now on the immediate effect of the need of supply chain, which is essential medical supplies and food. But as businesses slowly start to wake up, you realize that because of the global value chain that we were all applauding just a few years ago, the many steps it takes to make the iPhone or the Airbus and everything, you find that you are so dependent on someone else giving you the inputs before you can do the final product. And therefore, even production is having a negative knock-on impact. So you're right, Derek, as we look towards moving into and being prepared for a second wave, what sort of supply chains should we try to facilitate beyond just the essential medical supplies? What are the policies we need to put into place such that, let's have it, if you don't need to have strong trade rules now, that at least some more collaborative efforts to help it will be a good response. Before I open up to the audience, who I see has been sending us quite a few questions already, can I ask whether any of the panelists would like to comment on ideas that Derek has raised or some other second intervention points that you have in mind before I open the floor to the general audience?
If I may, Gabrielle, if I may, I think as we've discussed, we've been talking about supply chains and all that. One thing that we haven't quite touched on is the digital initiatives. Working from home, this webinar is an excellent example of how we have now changed the way we work and the way we are operating. So I think one thing that we need to also focus on, even as we talk of connectivity, is the importance of a robust digital connectivity to promote economic participation and drive inclusive growth. I think that's the other part. We are very traditionalist in that we know the basics of trade agreements, you know, but having this other element included in all the work that we do is new territory, is important for trade policy as well. Addressing issues of digital infrastructure, of digital divide, interoperability of systems. I think that would have a strong legal, we will need a strong legal framework for things like this. Data flows, free data flows, you know, facilitating the data flows, cybersecurity. I think all these are new aspects of work that we will need to incorporate into our trade policy. I thought I'd just put it out there for now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I think Gabrielle touched a bit on this earlier when she talked about the task force that the WTO has set up, which is focusing on e-commerce as well. I also have noted from reports coming out of Geneva that there's more interest now in the e-commerce initiative that's taking place, because I think the actualization of what we are going through has made us realize that we need to focus a little bit more on this digital aspect, because that's what is going to be very important, especially in such situations. Gabriella, can I give you the floor? You had a question you wanted to ask, then I'll go to Derek.
Oh, okay, I had a comment, and it's a little bit what you both raised, and I was surprised when Derek said the WTO is not working. Well, I think I've never worked as much as I have in the last sort of 2 months of confinement. But as you rightly said, Liz, what is happening is that everybody realized the importance of e-commerce, even those who had hesitation about whether or not it should be negotiated. Now people are, I mean, there may still be resistance from some corners for political reasons. There's an excellent proposal initiated by a group of Latin countries about trying to develop means and ways of working digitally, because this may take longer than we think, and it may come back. And it's true that in dispute settlement, everybody sort of thought, oh, well, we'll wait, it's going to take a few weeks and then we could have meetings. It may take more than that. Everybody must start thinking differently. We even read that the Supreme Court is having sort of virtual or telephone conference meetings. So I just wanted to say that I wouldn't say that WTO is not working, because the governments themselves, Singapore to start with, and then New Zealand, all their bilateral efforts, that their regional efforts, to the WTO website. This is WTO, it's not a meeting, but it's a different sort of thing. But everybody was looking for a place where they can express their opinions, their desire to collaborate, their fears, etc., etc. And this is what we basically, we all say the same thing, that one of the big turning point is digital in form of expressions. This conference is just one of them, but in the WTO, there are fears, however, and we should not deny, mainly the very poor country, and it's not digital they're concerned for having virtual meetings. They've expressed worries because they have such a little staff, that in capital, the few staff are busy dealing with emergency of COVID, that they have little availability of instructions from capital. It's not a virtual problem, it's more a crisis problem. But yes, we need to develop a new way of thinking. And yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Derek, you had a comment?
Yes, first a response to Gabrielle, and I think I must apologize, it was just poor choice of words. Certainly, I'm sure the WTO Secretariat is working much harder than before, as are all government servants, because there's no night or day. But I think what I was trying to convey was that the system as it was intended to function maybe there are certain challenges being faced right now because of the inability to meet physically. But happy to note that now there will be virtual meetings going forward. If I may just pose a question to Rebecca, and maybe I would just like to seek your views from the trade policy perspective. You mentioned that as a result of this pandemic, we are likely to see more diversification. And I would tend to agree. But I was just wondering, if you were a government official, what would you do? Would you couple greater diversification with also more localization? So there seems to be two parts of it. I'm just wondering what your views are on that.
I think it's about looking at your supply chain and your manufacturing strengths in total, and then making use of the existing free trade agreements, of alliances that you have to ensure that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. Essentially, it's that. It's looking at, so for in the context of, and also because of the way we're operating now, to be more agile, you need to make sure you can deliver very quickly, very fast. So your logistics, system, the resources that you can tap into for your manufacturing has, you would think that it has to be nearer to where you are. And that's why I'm talking, when I say regional, you're going to go closer to home in that sense. And where is the market also? You're manufacturing for the market, you have to be there. So if we are sourcing our products, our inputs and our exports are within this region, then you would think naturally that we would focus here. So bodies or mechanisms like ASEAN +3 become even more important as if I'm a trade negotiator today and a policy maker today, I would be looking at these. The value that can come, the maximum optimal value that I can get out of these arrangements. ASEAN +3 for sure. RCEP, getting it off the ground and quickly done and dusted. It's been dragging on too long. Elizabeth knows this. These are important mechanisms if you want to make sure that you get up and running, post-COVID.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think one of the points also that we need to factor in is comparative advantage. So certain economies will be able to do better diversification, some because of different state of development, and you also need to make sure that there's enough jobs locally. So it's a whole range of policies that need to be taken into account. I don't think it will be one size fits all, but we hope then that governments do the right thinking and discussing, and as Rebecca has said, take advantage of whatever regional network that you're already in to enhance your comparative advantage. I would just touch on Singapore. Singapore is a small island. For a lot of things, we cannot manufacture everything from scratch here because we just don't have enough land to do so. And so we need to think through as to what is it that we are quite happy to be reliant on a diversified import source. But what has brought to fore, I think COVID has done, is that we cannot just do just in time anymore. So I think one of the issues that we need to think about going forward as a policy mix with all this is how are you going to have a bit more flexibility over just in time so that in case there's a disruption, you're not going to be immediately at a loss. So this also means then that you have diversified warehousing, you have a certain way of looking into it. There's this call into play more 3D manufacturing sort of thing because you can stockpile those sort of things a bit more. So it's quite an interesting time that requires a lot of creativity and discussion and collaboration as we see what works best for different regions and for different types of products that we are talking about. one of the takeaways from COVID is almost every day you see a beautiful picture about blue skies, animals swimming everywhere, and how nature is, you know, blooming. And so do we really want to get rid of this as we go back to opening up the factories is another factor to think about, also about trade policies. We have quite a few questions which have come in. Just touching on a question that is based on what we were just discussing, which is directed to you, Rebecca, where it says that Dr. Rebecca Fatima mentioned the importance of keeping economies open, and I agree. Can states successfully open their economies when consumers consuming less and there's widespread unemployment and retrenchment?
I think it's not, the idea of keeping markets open is to ensure that there is that ability, you know, it's not about completely restricting imports or exports. I think that's what we mean. It's not about one's ability to purchase or not to purchase, but the fact is just keeping markets open and facilitating the flow. Eventually you get this virtuous cycle going, because if you restrict trade, you cut off manufacturing, you cut off jobs, you cut off income, livelihoods. You open it, you allow that virtuous cycle to grow, you know. So I think that's where we're coming from. So that, and supplies of, especially now, supplies of essential goods that we need, you know, if you close the market, then you get these artificial price increases, everybody loses. Yeah, so it's about working together. It's this collaboration among economies. The most vulnerable among us will suffer. And so that's why this whole idea of keeping markets open to ensure that we have access to the essential products that we need. It is not about whether we, you know, we're going to, oh, why are you doing this when nobody can afford it? You know, it's not about that.
I think,
Liz?
Yes, Gabrielle, you have a comment on that as well? Sure, I was going to give it to you.
Okay.
Gabrielle?
I think the distinction, thank you, should be made sometimes between products, and you highlighted that in part, products which we need to produce that we don't have enough, like we didn't have enough masks and things like that, and problems that relate to the distribution, the problem we face with food. So everybody says, oh, there's enough food in terms of presence, but it does not get distributed or it does not get dispatched. It's a problem that India faces domestically. So different sort of problems, the production and the distribution will call for different answers, and distribution is something that can be more easily tackled in a way in limiting restrictions. And I'd like to also draw your attention, I think it's yesterday, Lighthizer USTR in the US was saying, we have to start thinking about setting aside this famous efficiency and repatriate things in the US. Things were done outside for cost reason, efficiency. Well, I don't want to say that he's right, but the balance between trust and being able to rely and trust, essentially. Trust and efficiency will be part of a new formula to be tested by governments. So I just wanted to, this as a comment to Rebecca.
I agree. This is where I said, you know, we've smoked out inefficiencies and problems within our own systems. If you don't have a logistical chain that's efficient, if you don't have a cold chain, for example, how are you going to get products from point A to point B for your people? So it is that, fixing those weaknesses in your own systems. And I think the pandemic has really surfaced this.
Oh, sorry, I was just checking because we have some questions which have got a lot of support. So I'm trying to put it in order as to which is the next one. So Actually, the next question, which is garnering a lot of interest, is along these same lines about export restrictions and trust. So there are two questions that have been posed here, which have got quite a lot of support. One is, does the COVID-19 pandemic potentially move forward the idea of an agreement on e-commerce, which is what we were talking about just now? So, it should, and what are the areas? Or will it potentially entrench the existing risks regarding data localization? So any of the panelists want to talk about the e-commerce knock-on, especially on data? Gabrielle.
I'll be modest on this because it's very sensitive politically. I would invite everyone, there's an excellent paper on this COVID page made by the Secretariat, and there was a lot of press response because it proves that e-commerce becomes more important than ever. It doesn't give an answer to the tensions on data localization between China and US and all this. This is more political rather than technical. But I think that what is certain is that there's a need more than ever to deal with the issue, and there doesn't seem to be a better place than in the WTO. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I agree.
Gabrielle. Rebecca?
Those are sticking points in our agreements in ASEAN. We've gone through this in RCEP. These issues are still there, and we need to work through them. And at some point, it will come home to roost. We will need to face the realities of those issues, and those proponents need to be more firm and in coming out with the benefits of these policies. But as I said earlier, I mean, we need to ensure that we have the digital infrastructure in place. We need that. And more importantly, also, if the SMEs are going to benefit from this, the MSMEs, the women entrepreneurs, the small and medium enterprises, we need to focus as much as just as importantly, rather, on education and training for them, so that they can tap into this new way of doing business, and they can then benefit from this. This is where our support of vulnerable individuals and companies are so important. And there's a lot of work being done along those lines, even in APEC and ASEAN, when we talk of what we do collectively for our small and medium enterprises.
Liz,
Gabrielle?
maybe, yeah, which is linked a little bit to another question that I read about, and supporting what Rebecca just said. Already WTO agreements such as trade facilitation has put sort of a website and e-trading and e-exchanges up front. Other agreements like TBT with e-ping and all that do have these provisions, but they maintain also the more traditional paper sort of approach. And what I was giving as example is that some of these paper requirements that governments maintained have been sort of set aside during the crisis. So I think that the whole system was slowly going towards more I don't want to say e-trading in terms of service only, but trading goods via e-means. And I think that its response to this question, where does it come from? It comes from the principles of the new WTO, from trade facilitation, but it was already creeping in, and I should not use the word creeping, but being sort of expressed in old traditional agreements of the WTO, and it should just continue.
Thanks very much. So I agree. So the question that Gabrielle was referring to is, there's this question, say, are the trade facilitation measures such as e-trading and acceptance of online paperwork based on the trade facilitation agreement? So yes, the trade facilitation agreement has got paperless trade sort of a chapter and initiatives, but what is really important when we look into the practice and implementation of this is, to me, not so much data localization, but actually a bit of data privacy. And how do you allow the cross exchange of data, which would then facilitate the sending of the documents. Rebecca earlier had talked about the ASEAN single window. And in fact, this reluctance and the lack of trust is something which is actually impeding how it could accelerate, and more businesses could use the ASEAN single window. To Gabrielle's point just now on the TBT, I think I recall a few years ago, we were talking about how you can reflect the E-standard already in your product. So for all of you who have an iPhone, you will find the standard, the certificate is there on your phone already. There's no paper. You know, so how else can you modify that to other products as we go ahead? How can we take away the paper? So it's a bit of a nexus between the two, but I think it requires a lot of open-mindedness by regulators who may feel that it's taking away their power. So this is, you know, any views or comments about this as being an area as part of the e-commerce package that maybe we should also focus on? Does anyone have a say on that?
I don't have a say on that, but I have another aspect that we need to pay attention to when we're talking of e-commerce, and this is combining it with sustainability. I have a lot of concern when I order stuff online, and you know it comes with packages and piles and piles of paper and plastic. So that worries me. So we need to have that balance and to make sure that e-commerce and sustainable growth and the environmental issues are taken on board together, and they're not seen as separate. You know what I'm saying? This worries me when I see that. Yeah.
In fact, just this morning, one of my friends posted on WhatsApp how she just ordered a box of medicine, but it came in a bigger box, and it was just one small bottle at the end of the day. So it's a lot of package wasting. So it's things to think about as we move towards, you know, because then as you're moving the good, is there a better way to even do the redistribution from different sources? You know, is the break bulking in a different way for consumerization?
Indeed, Lise, they say that a lot of the progress that was made in the recent years and months on plastic, and there were discussions between members, you must be aware, about having this possibly statement on plastic, has backtracked importantly in the last 2 months because of health consideration. In the supermarket here in Geneva, plastic bags were prohibited, so some bring them back for health reasons. So it's, but on the long term, we need to find a solution.
Yes. It's not so straightforward as we find our way in finding out what the new trade policies and drives should be as we come up with the trade rules. An interesting question that has been posed to us is to Gabriella, is posed to, but any of the panelists can also respond, is do you think that the crisis is likely to help or hinder reform efforts in the WTO more broadly?
I think it will favor reforms and changes. For instance, on export restrictions, we've mentioned it, it's legal if it's temporary, which means government cannot use export restriction to pile up. And there has been proposals how we could favor movement through more transparency, where you keep a little bit in terms of prices, but you let things flow. So my feeling is that, as with e-commerce, crises are often the reasons for government to get closer. And I remember after the dramatic event of 11 September 2001, when the Doha round started, all governments, they had faced sort of a tragedy. They were willing to start something and help each other. Yesterday, the Chinese ambassador in Geneva said that he was disappointed that there was not enough collaboration. maybe there are tensions, of course, between China and US, but among the others, I would tend to think that there's a great sort of movement towards more collaboration. And this is how I started saying Singapore in March started that. So they were very, very wise, saying we're going to need, and it's been growing and growing. So my feeling is that, yes, it will lead to, I hope, concessions on both sides, but a realization that it's a question of surviving. It's a question of sustainable development, as Rebecca said. And I think in many areas, but all the areas of standard, of export restrictions, of e-commerce, governments will realize they have to agree on better and new rules and continue the efforts of transparency that they discuss, including this problem of stockpiling when you don't need it. So this is where regionalization, as Rebecca said again, is important, and trust. And that's not simple. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. Would anyone else like to comment on that point? If not, then there's another interesting question here from the floor, which is related to what we are talking about now. It talks about, dear panelists, accompanying the recent surge in PPE medical goods trade restrictions have been the increase in unilateral export controls on various forms of dual-use technology. The US, for example, is tightening controls on the re-exports of what it considers US origin items, which may affect exports of such items from Singapore, China. China was also planning to enact a comprehensive export control law this year. Are export restrictions normalizing? How can Singapore adapt to this new environment? Would any of the panelists like to be the first to take it? Gabrielle?
I'll go for it. That's a difficult one. So export restrictions, as I said, if it's for sort of critical situation on essential goods on a very short basis, it's okay. Now, there's also an exception, a general exception, as you know, Liz, under Article 20 of the GATT for health. Yeah. These would cover more long-term type of restrictions. But if you intervene, if you ask economists, they'll tell you maybe short-term to deal with a crisis is okay, but export restriction will generally have a domino effect and a boomerang effect, and everybody will pay for it. Now, whether some governments adopt these dual-use restriction and all that and invoke exceptions, yes, it's possible they do. Are they legal? If we want to be lawyerly, it depends on how it will work, but are they good? Most economists will tell you no. Now, in the WTO, it's important to remember we don't have any competition rules. So if a government decides to favor something domestically and disfavor another use, this may not be a WTO issue unless it restricts trade. But this question, in my view, is excellent, because it poses another issue, again highlighted indirectly, I think, by Rebecca when she referred to sustainable development. To me, I call it the new circular economy, not the traditional one where you say a plastic bag or a tire can become a floor, but we saw amazing situations where a car industry produced ventilators, and women in Afghanistan using this and that to produce ventilators. So we need to think about multiple use of products, not only on a daily basis, but in times of crisis. So this is why the supply chain really calls for a deep reflection. And these double use maybe should become triple and fourth use, and maybe in terms of crisis, you could say, now these forces will focus on this item. Now we need ventilator. The next crisis, I don't know what we will need. So the fact that we have a domestic law that requires it as such is not illegal. It depends what is invoked, but maybe it's not really a legal question. We should ask economists, what are the impact of that and who's going to pay the price for these restrictions, keeping in mind that the WTO rules have enough flexibility, I believe, to allow for crisis type sort of reaction that are distinct from sort of the everyday. And I really hope we'll develop further this circular economy, but multi-dimension, not only 2 use or 3 uses. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriella. Would anyone else like to comment on that? We have about 10 minutes left of our conference. So for those who are thinking of sending in a question, please send so now, because otherwise I'm slowly going to move into a wrap-up session. And one of the questions which I think which helps us move towards that is this one is, how will not less globalization and increased regionalization go hand in hand? It was addressed in bits and pieces earlier, but I think arising even from Gabriella's just point about multiple use. So if you are thinking about that, then how would it help us have increased regionalization perhaps? Because you've got more use from your factory space than just for the cars. Gabriella?
But I was not going to add to this, but if you allow me, I saw one question which we get often about the stimulus programs and the subsidies. And because there's only 2-3 minutes, it is true that in 2008 there were a lot. Remember, the US president helped the car industry in Detroit and all that. And nobody sued. And often governments, colleagues, and friends call, how come is this legal, not legal? How come countries don't sue? Well, countries don't sue at the moment, and Derek was good, and the opening speech was very wisely sort of targeting that. Now it's a crisis. People are dying, so we deal with masks and respirators. Now, of course, government need to protect their industry because you need a job to pay for your house and all this. Why is it that other governments did not sue? I don't know. We get this question all the time. They probably thought it's a crisis, it's like a war, let's forget it. And it was a lot of things that maintain jobs. Will government sue for all the subsidies now? I don't know. All I would say on subsidies or benefits or support, whether it's agriculture or industrial, is that as such subsidies are not illegal. Remember, if it's an export subsidy or if it's a local content, yes. Otherwise, industrial subsidy depends if they cause adverse effect. Well, are they causing adverse effect if their main use is to keep an industry alive? Are they changing market share? So it would not be simple. Those like you, Liz, who are experts, subsidy complaints are complex. So at the moment, let's not talk about that. And on agriculture, it's about food. Are these support illegal? Well, you know, some support in agriculture are fine. This is going to be a debate, as the initial speech pointed, for the future, if it's relevant, still relevant at the time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gabrielle. Does anyone else have any points to add on that? Otherwise, I would just, from my perspective, I would say probably those who live in glass houses will not throw stones. So if it's a global, everyone is doing stimulus and everything, you're not wanting to have, you know, too much attention drawn on your own, you're not going to sue another one unless you're from a certain country who is always looking out for certain comparative inequalities through his own lens. So that may continue. United States in the middle of all this crisis is launching more and more 232 investigations. So it's a very interesting world as well that's taking place as each government tries to see what works best for them. to get the popular vote, to get the jobs back in. So it's that sort of world. So who is going to be more litigious? I'll say, yeah, it will depend on the country and the appetite and what is going on. Gabrielle, you want to respond?
Not really. I think you summed it up very well. I would just repeat, it's like a war. It's a time of crisis. And during a war, something can be done that are illegal, but you sort of tolerate. And this pandemic gets almost close to a question of security. Yeah. And then you are really, the line between politics, survival, and law get a bit difficult to draw. So let's deal efficiently with the crisis. And this is why export restrictions, and this is why I'm so grateful to Singapore. Export restrictions are bad, not because they're illegal under WTO if they're long, but because they're bad for human beings. And let's deal with that. And after, let's negotiate more transparency rules and better rules. And thank you for having invited me, Liz, and Singapore.
Thank
Liz,
you very much. I was just going to ask everybody if they have final comments. So Rebecca, your final comments?
Thank you. I think during this time, it makes it even more important for us to support the multilateral trading system. I'm saying it not because I like you, Gabriella, but because I really believe in it. And more important, or rather equally important, is the engagement with the business sector. I think trade policy makers, the policy folks have to engage with the private sector to understand completely where they're coming from, what their constraints are, and then tackle it. For me, also the regional cooperation is important during this time. We need to come together to exchange health information. We talked so much about global supply chains, and for medical and food, coordinated policy responses, I think, during this time is so important. And regional cooperation at the end of the day is what will help us pool all our resources together and work towards resolving some of the issues that we talked about today, making sure that the measures that we put in place are temporary, are proportionate, all the good words that we use in the WTO, and that we are transparent. Transparency, I think, is the most important for us. Transparency and predictability for businesses are going to survive this. Those two elements are important. Singapore, I know you didn't talk about your own domestic law, temporary law to help businesses. I think that's another area where Singapore can really share information on how you've done it and how it works to just help companies tide through, during this difficult time. I think those are important aspects that we can share and benefit from each other. Thank you. Thank you for having me, Liz. Always good to share with you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Derek, any final words?
Yes, thanks, Liz. And I guess speaking as a lawyer, I would emphasize that the rule of law remains important in a crisis. Although it cannot produce the full solution, but in a way it also acts as a restraining force on certain state action. I think at the end of the day, when it comes to international law, there is also the other dimension of politics, and they go hand in hand. I think they are mutually reinforcing, at least in my view. In this case, Gabrielle has suggested that perhaps in a crisis, countries will close one eye. Perhaps that's true. But I think for Singapore, we are very practical people. At the end of the day, we just need to tide over this crisis, and then we can discuss the rules when the crisis is over. These are just my final comments. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Derek. Gabriella, you have something?
Yeah, I don't know whether I gave my final comments, but I think Derek and Rebecca said it. I would say transparency, transparency, transparency. And rule of law, of course. My message was just that, you know, you don't sue today or tomorrow or next month, but dispute can come afterwards. So the fact that there's no dispute at the moment doesn't mean that everything is okay. It means that governments focus on something else. But the transparency mechanism of the WTO and the efforts of transparency of all governments will only facilitate collaboration. And that's what we need now. And that's why I agree with the comments made by the previous speaker, Rebecca and Derek, that collaboration that has been pushed by Asia and others is really the way out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have come to the end of what has proved to be a very engaging 1.5 hours. I think if we had more time, there are a few more questions that we have not really had time to address. But I think the key point is that now is the time for practicality. We will see how governments respond to the trade policy action, what we learn from this, and whether new rules are needed to be put in place, maybe for supply chain connectivity, maybe re-looking a bit more at the paperless trade and sort of documentation, which then brings us into maybe this whole period has been a real boost into finally focusing on e-commerce and the rules that we need, because it's become very clear at these times of crisis how we need a lot of not just online shopping, but you know, if it persists, you will have telemedicine, you have online education, all these things will start to come to the fore. And while it's okay to do it domestically, if you suddenly want to do things cross-border, all these data issues, fintech issues, financial payments, privacy, all will start to come into force. So it's a good time, I would say, to use this crisis based on our actual living experience to see what we need to do to push it forward. So it's no longer just academic. A few other really good ideas have also cropped up in terms of dual use from a positive sense and not just from a trade restrictive sense. Also to look into how we can help on a regional basis those who to ratchet up, so that, you know, we look into regional cooperation for supply chains, for maybe stockpiling. ASEAN has a very famous rice stockpile, but should we do something beyond rice? Should we look into other areas? And the ASEAN rice stockpile is quite good because you don't really need to stockpile the rice. You just have an indicator you commit to supplying when people need to draw down on it. So that also helps. So time to think out of the box, but now in terms of transparency and predictability, that's very important, because governments and business need to know where to source the product from, where to send it through. So having clarity as to what are the open markets and what are the more restrictive markets helps in their own way develop a whole new supply chain. Since this is a legal conference, I would say yes, now everyone is being very practical, but as soon as things become a bit more level, flattening out, and people look into comparative disadvantages that are taking place, the disputes will come. So hopefully that's not so soon, and hopefully we have less use of self-judging exceptions as we go forward on this as well. So thank you very much. Lionel, would you like to say anything as we close?
Not much. I think I listen with interest. Obviously, these are all the experts in the area of trade and trade law and trade in general. I did think a little bit about the role of international law in this whole pandemic, and I just wanted to make sure that no one in the audience sort of went away thinking that somehow international law had been sidelined by all these political declarations and so on. Because I think the reality on the ground is lawyers in most governments have been busy advising their governments on the legality of different measures that these governments are thinking. It's just that I think this doesn't really get into the news, it doesn't really get seen. And I think as Gabrielle has said, we are in a crisis. So obviously, lawsuits are not exactly on the top of everyone's mind, but I think as things settle down, we probably will see some increased scrutiny. And it may be that the first legal actions that are taken may actually be on the investment law side of the house, where there are investor-state dispute settlement may be simply less constrained in terms of potential plaintiffs, because for states, the shoe may be on the other foot in a future scenario. And finally, I think the other bit about that I did reflect upon is many of these statements and declarations that we've been talking about may be non-legally binding, but I think we are really at the start of a long process, and I think at a certain point, this sort of shared understanding that we have certain vulnerabilities, there are certain gaps that we need to address, will be such that they will become building blocks for new legally binding norms. So I think that's probably where the overall sort of international law scene is at this point. Thank you very much, Liz.
No, thank you very much, Lionel, for bringing us back to the core issue of where do the lawyers and where does the law stand. The existing law, what needs to be modified, what needs to be changed, and what new laws we need to put into place from policy lessons that we are learning from COVID. Comparative advantage disputes are sure to come, but what do we do then as we each advise our, be it the government lawyers here advising the governments, or the private sector lawyers advising their companies as to how to source anything, how do you mitigate the potential of such disputes is also something I think we should focus and pay attention to. Yes, it's crisis, but some people's timelines of patience are limited compared to ours. So without any further ado, I'd like to thank all the panelists and Lionel for opening the session. As I said, it's been a very invigorating discussion. I'd like to thank all the audience for your participation. I do apologize, we didn't have time to respond to all the questions which were submitted, but I hope the ones that we picked are the ones that got the most interest going, and it gives you all food for thought as you go back to your day jobs as well. So I will hand over now to Zerwin, who will close the session for us.
A big thank you again to all of our speakers and our moderator for bringing your expertise and your intellect to a really exciting and stimulating discussion we had this afternoon. Thank you, all of you listeners, for joining us. If you enjoyed today's session, please do be sure to join us for 2 more sessions that we have in this COVID-19 Challenge to the International Legal Order series. We have one coming up tomorrow on investment and dispute settlement, and one next Wednesday on ASEAN. Thank you all very much. Good evening. Goodbye.